Okay, we are going to talk about Iranian history, and I'm going to break this up into a couple of different videos. So we're going to start at the beginning, around 559 BC or BCE, whichever you prefer. Most Iranians look back to that as the beginning of sort of the modern nation of Persia or Iran. The man who led the country then was named Cyrus the Great. Cyrus like Miley Cyrus. And the Achaemenid dynasty. And this dynasty covered a pretty large part of the world, or at least that part of the world at the time. So the Persian Empire was really the first back in the day, it's really the first superpower. The world hadn't seen a dynasty or an empire that big before. So most Iranians look back to that time as the beginning of the modern nation. About 200 years later, Alexander the Great comes in, basically from what we now know as Greece, and he comes in and he takes it over, and he takes over that whole part of the world. So that's a big change there. And then a number of different dynasties control what is Persia a little bit over the next couple of hundred years. If you remember from last quarter, from 570 to 632 of AD or CE, whichever you prefer, that's the life of Muhammad. And if you remember, after Muhammad was born, he basically founds Islam, and Islam starts to spread. And in the 600s, basically the Arabs take over Persia, and they bring with them Islam. And so that's when Persia, or now Iran, becomes basically Muslim. It goes back to the 600s. So it's been for about, 1,500 years now, something like that. It's basically been an Islamic country or land or nation, whatever you want to call it. So this is a big historical event, because that's when Islam comes to Persia. The 1200s, we've talked about them a little bit before when we talked about the Middle East. The Mongols come in from Mongolia, they take over Persia, they're also going to take over the Middle East. They just sweep through and take over everything, but they're not particularly interested in governing, they're more interested in conquering, and so they don't stay too long. Sort of the next big dynasty there is called the Safavid dynasty. So they're going to rule over Persia, as it's still called at this point. And this is a big historical dynasty because they built upon the Islam that was already there, but they made Persia Shia or Shiite. And if you remember from last quarter, we talked about how there's two different sort of sects of Islam, Sunni and Shia, and most countries around the world are majority Sunni. Iran is one of the only countries that is majority Shia, and that goes back to that dynasty. In fact, even today, 90 to 95% of Iranians are, in fact, Shia or Shiite, and that goes back to the Safavid dynasty. So they're going to be there about 200 years or so. And so different dynasties come in and rule over this part of the world, but basically Persia has been an entity for almost 2,000 years. Persia has been a thing for 2,000 years. If you remember when we talked about Nigeria, Nigeria is sort of a creation of the British where they randomly drew some lines and threw some people together who didn't really have much in common. That's not true of Iran. Iran has basically been an entity for about 2,000 years ago, so there's a strong sense of nationalism, of pride. Iran is absolutely not just a state, but also a nation. 1769 to 1925. You have a dynasty called the Qajars, and they come in And they're different from the Safavids. First of all, they're fairly weak. They don't have a whole lot of control over the people. They're not viewed as a particularly strong dynasty. Unlike the Safavids, they believe in a separation of religion and government. So Islam is one thing, government is another. They were the heads of government, but they didn't claim to be Islamic rulers or religious officials. So religion and government are different for the Qajars. So there is a tradition in Iran of separating those two things out. And also during this time, over time, particularly in the later years of the Qajars, the British play a pretty big role in the south of Persia. And the Russians play a pretty big role in the north. And so Persia is not a British colony or a Russian colony. It's not a British colony like Nigeria was. But the British do have an influence there, and the Russians have an influence in the north. So the Qajars are not a particularly strong dynasty. In 1906, the Persians draft their first constitution. And it's going to have some things in there that we recognize. Even though the Qajars are still the leaders, the kings, they create a strong legislature, which they call the Majlis, because that is the Persian word for legislature. So there's a legislature now where people can elect lawmakers. There's separation of powers between different branches. There's a Bill of Rights. So at this point, Persia is moving towards more of a Western-style government with a relatively weak monarch, but an elected legislature and a Bill of Rights, something that would look very familiar to us and to Western Europeans. So they appear to be moving sort of towards democracy in a lot of ways. On the other hand, also in that constitution, though, Shia is the official religion, so they make that clear. And they put something in that constitution called the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council can veto any laws passed by the legislature that are inconsistent with Islam. So in some ways they're moving towards a democracy, but in some ways they're still acting as a theocracy with Islam at the core. So it's sort of split. They're trying to have it sort of both ways, which is something they're really still trying to do today. 1908. Oil is discovered. And so the West suddenly gets a lot more interested in Persia than it had been. Because not long after this, cars are going to be rolling off the assembly line, and you're going to need oil more and more. So the West starts paying more attention to Iran in 1908. As I said before, the Qajars are pretty weak. And in 1925, there's a military officer named Reza Khan Pahlavi. And he engineers a coup. And names himself king. And the Persian word for king is Shah. And so he kicks out the Qajars, he names himself king. It's now the Pahlavi dynasty. As of 1925. And we're going to call, just for ease of reference, we're going to refer to him as Shah number 1. Okay, the first Shah of Iran. He's not the first Shah, but that's what we're going to call him. He's the first Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty. So he comes in, he takes over. You've got a new dynasty. he is a modernizer. So we watched a video about Ataturk in Turkey, who says Turkey's going to sort of model itself after Europe and bring the country up to speed. And Shah #1 agreed with that. He also, like Ataturk, he was not big on Islam. He was Muslim in name, but it didn't play a big role in his life. He wasn't particularly interested in keeping the rules of the Quran. So in many ways, he's sort of the Ataturk of Persia. So he does a lot of the same things that Ataturk did. He said no more veils for the women. The men were not allowed to wear beards because that was associated with Islam. No more public schools. But he also does things like he builds railroads and he builds factories because he wants to move Persia from being sort of a small, weak agricultural country to one that's industrial with factories, with communications between cities and things like that. So he's trying to modernize Iran. He is also, however, an autocrat. And so basically, once he takes over, he starts calling all the shots. He weakens the modulus. He doesn't listen to the legislature anymore. He's not particularly worried about the Bill of Rights. All the power is with him, and he's going to use that power to try to modernize and make Persia more of a modern country. In 1935. He renames Persia Iran, and so that's when the current name comes into existence. And a few years later, right at the beginning of World War I, he gives up the throne to his son. And his son is named Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And for ease of reference, we're going to call him Shah #2, because he is the second Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty. So you've got a new Shah now. He's relatively young. He has been educated in boarding schools in Europe, so he has a very pro-European, pro-Western outlook. He really, in some ways, feels more comfortable in Europe than he does in Iran, but he is the new king. He's the new Shah. And like his father, Islam does not play a huge role in his life or his governing. He's more of a modernizer, sort of more of a Westernizer. So he is on the throne, very young Shah. In 1951, there is a prime minister named Mossadegh. And Mossadegh is starting to feel powerful. He knows he's got a young king, and so he starts to take over power to himself. He's head of the legislature, and he nationalizes the oil industry. The government takes over the oil industry, takes all the oil back. They had previously signed contracts with BP, British Petroleum, and a lot of Western oil companies, and he basically canceled those contracts, said the government owns the oil again, and took it over. So the West isn't very happy about that. The US, Britain, they're not very happy about that. So in 1953, the Shah #2, the young Shah, had left and gone to Europe when Mossadegh did this and took over. The US and the UK put the Shah #2 back in power. They brought him back from Europe. We paid some generals to sort of engineer a coup, and so Shah #2 is back. And Mossadegh goes to jail. Why would we do that? Why would we care? First of all, it has to do with oil, is that we wanted access to the oil again. But also, there was some concern. Mossadegh had already nationalized the oil industry, and there was some concern that he was going to go full-on communist, and at this point we are in the middle of the Cold War. We didn't want that to happen, and the Shah we felt was a reliable ally of ours, and so we sort of engineered a coup to put Shah number 2 back on the throne. And I'll show you a picture of Shah number 2. And there he is right there. And so you can see he looks very much like a king. And that's what he is. He's not a religious figure. He's not particularly interested in Islam. He's a king. He uses a lot of the country's wealth for himself and for his queen, and has houses all over. And very much not just a king, but a dictator. He is in charge. He's not like the Queen of England, who's just a figurehead. He is actually making the decisions. It's basically a one-man government in Iran at this point. And the one man in charge is that guy, Shah number 2. So he is back on the throne now with backing from the US, with backing from Britain, and feels pretty secure in his place. And in the 1960s, he brings something to Iran called the White Revolution. And so what he wants to do, like his father, is he wants to modernize. So like his father, he wants to industrialize, move Iran from being agricultural to industry, and to get away to some extent from the sale of oil being the highest source of revenues. He wants to industrialize. He wants women to have more rights. He wants women to be able to work in the workplace, to wear whatever they want, etc. He actually takes land from a lot of the clerics and the religious people in Iran. He takes some of their land and gives it to the poor, so they've got some land of their own that they can farm or do whatever they want with. And again, he's big on like roads, schools, hospitals. So these are all things that basically we in the West most of us would look at and say, well, this is a good thing. He's doing some good things in Iran. On the other hand, he doesn't listen to the legislature at all. He makes all the decisions. It's basically a one-man show. No elections, no real elections. They may have some, but there's only one political party called the Resurgence Party, and that party is led by the Shah. And he's got these people called Savak. And if anybody complains, if you dissent in any way, Savak shows up at your door and they put you in jail or beat you up or something worse than that. So they're sort of his enforcers to make sure that he stays in charge and that nobody complains against his rule. And he also uses a lot of the country's wealth for himself. He's got palaces all over and lives a very lavish lifestyle, etc. So there's some good things about the Shah, but there's also some bad things. We remain friends with him because basically he sells us oil. He is not communist. He's not friends with the Soviets. We like some of the things he's doing anyway, and he brings kind of some stability to the region. So we support him. Iran at this point has the 4th largest military in the world, mostly because they buy a lot of guns and weapons from us. So he is very much supported by us. And in the 70s, the economy really takes off, and things are getting much better economically in Iran. A lot more people are making money in the middle class, and lifestyle for a lot of people really isn't that bad economically. But politically, they don't have any rights at all. It's all about the Shah. There's no meaningful elections. So there's a little bit of tension there in the 70s. And so while this is going on, there's a Muslim cleric who's living in France. He's Iranian, but he lives in France because he's been kicked out of the country, and his name is Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah is a religious title like bishop or something like that. Very strong Muslim, does not like the Shah because he's taking land from the clerics, because he's giving women more rights. He doesn't really sort of respect Islam in the way that Ayatollah Khomeini would, and so giving speeches against the Shah. So in the 70s, the Shah looks to be in control. Things look to be going pretty well economically, but there's this sort of undercurrent of criticism of him, most of it led by Ayatollah Khomeini. He gives these speeches in France. They're placed onto a cassette tape. The cassette tapes are sort of passed from person to person, sort of underground to listen to. So that's sort of where we are in the 70s, and we're going to stop there for now.